Welcome everyone to this long delayed, and I apologize for that, episode 444 of Just Joshing. I am your host, Joshua Pentelarusco. I write Up in Podcast 2. Today, story time featuring Mckayla Eaton is here. So this is going to be kind of a, there's been a couple of reasons for the delay. One of them is I haven't stopped doing interviews. In fact, I've been doing a lot more of them. If you go on my YouTube channel, Joshua Pentelarusco, you have seen I've done 5 interviews in the last week online, featuring a variety of guests from all over United States. I've talked to some really cool people getting ready for 101 Tales, and I've been working out the kinks while I'm at it. I'm setting up for the talk show, which I've already got the first 2 weeks of guests completely lined up on. So it's not like I haven't been doing like podcast stuff. I have, but I need to wrap this up, and I want to make sure this was good. So I made good. I have 6 more episodes to make after this one, and we are done the completely audio version of the podcast at 450. 451, 449, and 451 are featured with the same guests, which I think is kind of cool. But we'll get more into that later. This is Alice in Wonderland, Chapter 4. I really felt sorry for Bill reading this. It was a lot of fun to do, but Bill, poor Bill. Oh, poor Bill. We'll just get into that right now. Talk some more later.
This episode of Just Joshing is sponsored by Indie Imprint. Indie Imprint supports creators by creators. Whether you are writing a book or creating a video game, Indie Imprint works with its clients to produce, edit, and present their projects to the world. For more information, check out their website at www.indieimprint.com.
Chapter 4. The Rabbit Sends in a Little Bill. It was the White Rabbit, trotting slowly back again, and looking anxiously about as it went, as if it had lost something, and she heard it muttering to itself, the Duchess, oh my dear paws, oh my fur and whiskers, she'll get me executed as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice guessed in a moment that it was looking for the fan and a pair of white kid gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them. But they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and the great hall, with the glass table and little door, had vanished completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice as she was hunting about, and called out to her in an angry tone, "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment, and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now!" And Alice was so much frightened that she ran off at once the direction it pointed to, without trying to explain the mistake that it had made. "He took me for his housemaid," she said to herself as she ran. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. But I better take him his fan and gloves. That is, if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking and hurried upstairs, in great fear lest she could meet the real Mary Ann, and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and gloves. "How queer it seems," Alice said to herself, "to be going messages for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah'll be sending me messages next." And she began fancying the sort of thing that would happen. "Miss Alice, come here directly, and get ready for your walk." "Coming in a minute, nurse, but I've got to watch this mouse hole till Dinah comes back and see that the mouse doesn't get out. Only I don't think," Alice went on, "that they let Dinah stop in the house if it began ordering people about like that." By this time she had found her way into a tidy little room with a table on the window, and on it, as she had hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and the pair of the gloves, and was just going to leave the room, when her eyes fell upon a little bottle still near the looking-glass. There was no label this time with the words "Drink Me," but nevertheless she uncorked and put it to her lips. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything. So I'll just see what this bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." It did so indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling, and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more. As it is, I can't get out at the door. I do wish I hadn't drunk quite so much." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this, and she tried the effort of lying down with one elbow against the door, and the other arm curled around her head. Still she went on growing. And as a last resource, she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney, and she said to herself, "Now I can do no more. Whatever happens, what will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still it was very uncomfortable, and as there seemed to be no sort of chance for her ever getting out of the room again, no wonder she felt unhappy. It was so much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down the rabbit hole, and yet, it's rather curious to know this sort of life. I do wonder what can happen to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, and there ought, and when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now, she added in a sorrowful tone. At least there's no room to grow up any more here. But then, thought Alice, shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort, one way, never to be an old woman. But then, always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that. Oh, you foolish Alice, she answered herself. How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for any lesson books. And so she went on, taking first one side and then the other, and making quite a conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes she heard a voice outside, and stopped to listen. "Marianne, Marianne," said the voice, "fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was the rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inwards and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard say to herself, "Then I'll go round and get in at the window." "That you won't," thought Alice. And after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall, and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible to fall into a cucumber frame, or something of the sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then a voice she never heard before. "Sure, then I'm here, digging for apples, your honor." "Digging for apples indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "Now, tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "Sure, it's an arm, your honor," she pronounced it. "Arm." "An arm, you goose? Who ever saw one that size? Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure it does, your honor, but it's an arm for all that." "Well, it's got no business there, at any rate. Go and take it away." There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Sure, I don't like it, your honor, at all, at all. Do as I tell you, you coward." And at last she spread out her hand again, and made another snatch in the air. This time there were 2 little shrieks, and more sounds of broken glass. "What a number of cucumber frames there must be," thought Alice. "I wonder what they'll do next. As for pulling me out of the window, I only wish they could. I'm sure I don't want to stay in here any longer." She waited for some time without hearing anything more. At last came the rumbling of little cartwheels, and the sound of a good many voices all talking together. She made out the words, "Where's the other ladder? Why, I hadn't to do but bring one. Bill's got the other. Bill, fetch it here, lad. Here, put 'em up on this corner. Now time to get it first. They don't reach half high enough yet. Oh, they'll do well enough. Don't be particular. Here, Bill, catch hold of this wall. Will the roof bear? Mind the loose slate. Oh, it's coming down. Heads below!" A loud crash. "Now who did that? It was Bill, I fancy. Who's to go down the chimney? Nay, I shan't. You do it." "That I won't, then. Bill's got to go down. Here, Bill, the master says you got to go down the chimney." "Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he?" said Alice to herself. "Why, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little." She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could and waited until she heard a little animal, she couldn't guess what sort it was, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney house close above her, and then saying to herself, "This is Bill." She gave one sharp kick and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was the general chorus of, "There goes Bill!" Then the rabbit's voice alone, "Catch him, you by the hedge!" Then silence, and then another confusion of voices. Hold! Up his head! Brandy now! Don't choke him! How was it, old fellow? What happened to you? Tell us all about it. The poor little lizard, Bill, was in the middle, being held up by 2 guinea pigs who were giving it something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran up as hard as she could, and soon found herself safe in the thick wood. The first thing I've got to do, said Alice to herself, as she wandered about in the wood, is to grow to my right size again, and the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan. It sounded an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was that she had not the smallest idea how to set about it, and while she was peering about anxiously among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her with large round eyes, and feebly stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. Poor little thing, said Alice in a coaxing tone, and she tried hard to whistle to it, but she was terribly frightened all the time at the thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up in spite of all her coaxing. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little bit of stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped into the air off all its feet at once, with a yelp of delight, and rushed at the stick, and made believe to worry it. Then Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick, and tumbled head over heels in its hurry to get hold of it. Then Alice, thinking it was very like having a game of play with a cart horse, and expecting every moment to trample under its feet, ran around the thistle again. Then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running a very little way forwards each time and a long way back, and barking hoarsely all the while, till at last it sat down in a good way off, panting, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, and its great eyes half shut. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once, and ran till she was quite tired and out of breath, until the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. And yet what a dear little puppy it was, said Alice, as she leaned against the buttercup to rest herself, and fanned herself with one of the leaves. I should have liked teaching it tricks very much, if I'd only been the right size to do it. Oh dear! I'd nearly forgotten that I've got to grow up again. Let me see. How is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other. But the question is, what? The great question certainly was what. Alice looked all around her at the flowers and the blades of grass, but she couldn't see anything that might be like the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and when she had looked under it, and on both sides of it, and behind it, it occurred to her that she might as well look and see what was on top of it. She stretched herself up to tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top with its arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah, and taking not the smallest notice of her or of anything else. I leave things off with the hookah-smoking caterpillar, because, caterpillars should always be smoking hookahs. I've been reading from the annotated Alice. It's actually giving me all kinds of cool ideas for the Alice 1 as I'm working on it right now. It's one of the 2 books I'm working on right now. The other one being Corey. And Corey's been a lot of fun. I've gotten about to the halfway point of that book. And I'm working on Alice 1, which is kind of going to be the most devastating croquet game in the universe, I promise. But we'll get to that another day. I want to talk about Mckayla real quick, and then I'm going to go wrap the show up. Mckayla is one of those people that I really, really admire. Me and her had a great talk as much after the podcast as with it, and she has gladly donated a piece of something to read, so we're going to get to that and then talk about everything else going on. So without further ado, here's Mckayla Eaton.
Prologue. Despite the fact that humans have been summoning demon for millennia, we still know very little about them. Section 10 will cover the basics of demonology. Do not attempt to summon a demon until you have covered this section of the handbook, and do not, under any circumstances, ever summon a high demon. A Handbook for the Young and Magical, Section 1, Chapter 1. The witch had an old leather-bound Latin tome pressed to her chest as she stood under the light of the full moon, waiting. It was nearly midnight. The hour, the moon, and the dead language were entirely unnecessary for performing magic, but it wasn't every night a girl got to summon a high demon. Might as well make it theatrical. She wished she could have had a better venue. A graveyard had been considered, but she was already summoning a literal hellion. Disturbing the dead while she was at it would be pushing her luck. She'd settled on a high school baseball diamond instead. It was abandoned at this time of night. She'd sat out on the bleachers and waited until the janitor had come out, had a smoke, and locked up. Then she had to wait until 12. The time didn't have any significance other than her not wanting to be discovered. The diamond she stood in was in the middle of a suburb, and what she was about to do would be awfully hard to explain to the authorities. The lines of the diamond were recently painted. That would help. Demons didn't like geometry. Straight lines and perfect shapes confused them. Symmetry was alien to those that craved chaos. Midnight arrived. The witch opened the tome to the page she needed for reference and then set it on the dirt. She took a knife from her pocket and walked to the center of the diamond. Drawing blood was harder than she'd expected it to be. The amount of pressure she'd needed to break the skin, despite the sharp blade, surprised her, and it stung so bad that her eyes immediately began to water. She bit her lip and sniffed the tears away before they fell. She squeezed her hand into a fist to make the blood flow faster and did her best to make a straight line in the dirt. The blood running between her fingers was uncomfortably warm. She returned to the book and picked it up. It was ancient. A little dirt and blood weren't going to hurt it now. Opening the portal was easy. It wasn't any old hole into hell. It was a door built specifically to keep a high demon in, not to keep snooping witches out. Luckily for her, the people who had locked it up had left behind instructions to release it again, though she didn't think they had intended on anyone actually doing it. But here I am. She said the Latin words her predecessors had left behind, written by a neat hand in the margin of the grimoire. The annotations weren't nearly as old as the book was, but their author had still used Latin for the spells, English for everything else. Old school. The portal had been designed to open to that spell, and open it did, right along the line of blood the witch had made. It was tall and dark and endless, like a waterfall of ink, frozen in time. The stillness that surrounded it was unnatural, as if it had devoured all the noise in the world and sucked it into the void. Then the void moved, like a ripple in a pool, and two enormous yellow eyes stared out. Then a third blinked and opened right below them. The witch stared, the tome all but forgotten in her bloody palm. A great claw-like hand reached out of the portal, hooking its fingers around the edge. The demon began pulling itself out, its black, mist-like body emerging from the portal. Something tugged at the back of the witch's mind. There was another spell, a spell to send the demon back to its prison. She shook off her initial amazement and flipped the page. The second spell was written along the bottom, spanning both pages. She read it, quickly and more loudly than she had the first time, and the demon stopped. All three eyes locked on her. Then it opened its mouth in a soundless scream. Sound erupted from the portal like a jet plane starting up, and the demon was sucked back in, its haunting yellow eyes disappearing into the blackness. The portal stood as it had before, a wall of liquid black. Then it cracked, and a tear cut through its surface. The witch watched as the portal disappeared. It had worked. The spell held, but she'd weakened it. The instructions hadn't mentioned it was disposable, one-time use only. Some spells were like that. After you used them, they just snapped. The diamond was silent again. Not unnaturally so, just the normal midnight solitude of suburbia. Then there was a loud pop, and another. Transformers were blowing all over the neighborhood. Soon dogs were barking and car alarms were going off. House lights were coming on all down the street. The witch ran to the line of her own blood and kicked at the dirt, burying it. Then she pulled up her hood, tucked the tome under her arm, and ran. Chapter 1. Summoned. This handbook was created as a supplementary learning tool for young witches and wizards. All young magicians should look to their tutors as their primary source of instruction and knowledge. A handbook for the young and magical. Introduction. Alton lay on his side, watching the red numbers on his bedside clock change and listening to the heavy breathing of his roommate. The townhouse and the street outside were quiet. Of all the places Alton had traveled for his studies, this was one of the nicest. Too bad it also came with one of the worst tutors. Edgar Daniels was a small, thin man with a nasally voice and a perpetually bad attitude. He ran his house like a military base, and Alton was public enemy number 1. It wasn't Alton's fault he was smarter than his tutor. Though Daniels probably wouldn't hate me so much if I didn't point it out. Alton looked across the room at Brandon. As far as roommates went, Brandon was decent. As far as wizards went, Brandon was horrible. He didn't even seem interested in magic. He didn't do the readings or the exercises. He'd sleep in every day if it weren't for Alton, and he spent more time texting girls than he did studying. Alton sighed. Brandon was probably the most normal wizard Alton had ever met. Alton rolled onto his back and closed his eyes. Daniels hated him and refused all his requests for a new tutor or to let him do more advanced magic. Brandon was nice, and they got along fine, but he was distracted and often needed the lessons repeated to him. They were holding Alton back. Snoring broke the peace in the quiet room. Alton's eyes snapped open, and he looked at the time. 1 o'clock. Daniels would be asleep. Now that he knew Brandon was sleeping soundly, Alton threw off the sheet and quietly got out of bed. He grabbed his phone from the side table and went to the door. Turning the handle slowly, he managed to open it without the latch clicking. He was probably being overly cautious. Daniels slept with earplugs and an eye mask. The chances of him waking up were slim. Door open, Alton crept down the hallway, sock feet slipping soundlessly over the hardwood. He paused at Daniel's room to listen. There was no snoring yet, but the door was shut and there was no light coming from underneath the door. Alton continued down the hall to the stairs and made his way to the living room. The space consisted of 2 leather love seats, a coffee table, some paintings, and 4 bookcases. No TV, no video games, no fun in Daniel's house. That didn't bother Alton. He'd come for the books. Most of the shelves were bare, except for a few framed photos and potted plants, the kind of knickknacks people that don't read think belong on bookshelves. The top shelves were the only ones with books on them. There was an assortment of classics, cheap paperbacks, and 1 collection of 4 older volumes. Alton used the light from his phone to read the spines. An Examination of Complex Enchantments, Volume 1. Alton slid the first book off the shelf, then paused, holding his phone against the cover to block the light. He thought he'd heard a noise. He went to the doorway and peeked out. The house remained dark. Daniel's door at the top of the stairs was still closed. Alton went back into the living room, closing the door quietly behind him. He placed his palm flat against the wall and cast a minor enchantment. The already quiet room became dead silent. No noise would escape. If someone pressed their ear to the door, they would hear nothing. Alton sat down on one of the love seats and opened the book. Using the light from his phone again, he read over the table of contents. He skipped the introduction and historical notes chapter and flipped to the part on advanced enchantments of inanimate things. The first exercise was simple. Alton had seen it outlined before in a book he had similarly borrowed from his last tutor. He'd need the next volume to get any new information. He had just stood up when he caught something move out of the corner of his eye, causing him to spin around. The door of the living room was open, and Daniels, dressed in a plaid bathrobe and worn blue slippers, stood in the doorway, scowling at Alton. "The problem with simple soundproofing enchantments is that you also impede yourself from hearing anything on the outside," Daniels said, crossing his arms over his thin chest. Alton sighed and returned the book to the shelf. He knew that. He knew you had to add a second layer to the enchantment so that it wasn't soundproof both ways, but he hadn't thought Daniels would wake up. "I didn't mean to wake you, Mr. Daniels," Alton said, trying to smooth over the situation before he got a lecture. "You didn't. I was already awake." "At 1 a.m?" Alton asked, turning back to his tutor. Daniels had an unpleasant look on his face, like he was chewing on a lemon and trying not to show it. "Yes, you have a visitor." "A visitor?" Alton asked in surprise. Daniels turned and walked away. "He's in the kitchen," he called over his shoulder. Alton followed. "A visitor? In the middle of the night?" The kitchen lights were on, something you couldn't tell from the bottom of the stairs. Alton cursed himself for not making sure Daniels was in bed before sneaking a peek at the books he'd explicitly expressed were off limits. At least the visitor got me out of a lecture. A stranger sat at the kitchen island, stirring a cup of tea. Alton had no idea who might want to speak with him so badly that they'd come to his tutor's house at 1 a.m. The man stood as they came in and held out a hand to Alton. His black coat looked a little too thick for this time of year, but so did the green sweater he wore beneath it. He had a close-cut beard that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to be white or gray, like the old men who dressed up as Santa and sat in malls at Christmas. Beyond that, there was nothing jolly about him. He was thin, with a nose that had been broken more than once, and wrinkles around his eyes and forehead. They distorted his face in a way that didn't touch his eyes, which appeared ageless. "I'm Professor Victor Orvius. I apologize for the hour," the man said. "I have business to attend back home, or else I would have postponed meeting with you until daylight." "That's all right," Alton said, shaking Orvius's hand before sitting on the stool across from him. "It's not like you woke me." "You've had many tutors," Orvius said. His voice was hoarse, tired. He claimed to be in a rush, but his tone was patient as he casually went back to stirring his tea. "Yeah, 5, including Professor Daniels," Alton said. "It's unusual for a student to be moved so much. Your previous tutor told me it was because you surpassed their studies and they had nothing left to teach you. Is that correct?" "I requested to be moved," Alton said, wondering why these questions were important. "I felt like my tutor couldn't teach me anything new." "You were ill-placed then. Did you not take a test?" "I did." "And you did poorly?" "There are no wizards in my family," Alton said. "When I was tested, I didn't know anything about magic. I couldn't answer a single question." "You've advanced significantly since then." Alton shrugged. "I read a lot." "Yes, your tutors mentioned that." Orvius removed the spoon from his teacup and tapped it on the rim to remove a few clinging drops before setting it on the counter. Alton watched him as he sipped it and appeared to find it satisfactory. "I'm looking for a student like you, Alton. I have a new method of instruction that is challenging and slightly unorthodox. I need a quick-witted pupil capable of learning things without constant guidance from myself." That sounded perfect, exactly what Alton had been looking for. A way to advance, a way to really prove what kind of wizard he could be. It sounded too good to be true. "I'll take my tests in a year," Alton said, cautiously, trying to figure out the man's motives. "I need to pass if I ever want to practice magic on my own." "My instruction will only better prepare you for the chamber's examinations," Orvius said. Alton nodded slowly as he thought about the offer. "What's the catch?" "As I said, the instruction is experimental, so I would appreciate it if you wouldn't question my tactics while you're studying under me. Aside from that, there's no catch. I've already filled out the necessary forms for the transfer of a student, and another boy is lined up to take your spot with Professor Daniels. If you accept, your transfer will be just the same as the ones you've done before." "He's a professional by now," Daniels added. "A flight risk." Alton ignored the slight. He'd made up his mind. "I'll do it." "I have some tests for you first," Orvius said, not blinking an eye at Alton's agreement, "to make sure you're as good as I've been led to believe." "Right now?" Alton asked. Orvius removed an orange from the fruit bowl sitting on the far end of the island. He placed it on the counter between them. Enchanting. Giving an inanimate object a property it wouldn't otherwise possess. The definition rolled off Alton's tongue without hesitation. Very good. Do it. Alton looked at the orange. He'd come to realize that the difference between a good spell and a great one was in its execution. The trick was to perform it without anyone noticing. You had to make every move, every twitch, look natural. Spellcasting was fairly easy to do undetected, but enchanting was much harder. You had to actually touch the object you were manipulating. Alton opened a drawer in front of him, removing a knife. He held the fruit with his fingertips and began slicing. When it was in 4 even pieces, he put down the knife and sat back on his stool. Maybe he didn't understand the objective, Daniel said, smiling smugly as he looked at the mundane orange, slowly leaking juice onto the countertop. Orvius picked up one of the slices and pulled off the peel, popping the piece of orange into his mouth. Alton watched as he chewed, but his features never wavered. Come on, who doesn't like chocolate? Very good, Orvius said when he had finished his bite of orange. What? Daniels asked, looking shocked. He didn't do anything. Do you have a napkin? Orvius asked, looking at his fingers, sticky with orange juice. Daniels was all but pouting as he retrieved a napkin from the cupboard and brought it to Orvius, who wiped off his hands as best he could before he balled up the napkin, setting it aside. Spell casting, Orvius said. Like dueling? Alton asked. I'm not sure we have enough room for that in the kitchen. We could go outside, but we might alarm the neighbors. Orvius smiled, an ever so slight turn of his lips. A simple spell will suffice. Anything I want? Orvius nodded. Alton drummed his fingers on the counter, acting like he was taking a moment to decide, but he had already put his spell into motion, using the movement of his fingers to prompt it in the direction he wanted. A stream of white shot across the counter from Alton's fingers toward Orvius's discarded napkin. It made no noise except for a quiet creaking sound. Orvius picked up the napkin, now frozen solid. He scrunched his fist around it, breaking the fragile, frozen paper, which crumbled onto the counter. Daniel snorted, obviously not impressed. It was a simple spell, true, but Alton's execution had been spot on. Nothing extravagant, just effective and discreet. Wizards like to be theatrical, but in a duel, it was too easy to anticipate your opponent's move from their body language. It was the silence of magic that made it so effective and dangerous. Give away your spells with dramatic flicks of the wrist or throwing of the hands, and you've given up your edge. Orvius said nothing, ignoring the broken bits of napkin already beginning to thaw, and took the knife Alton had used, holding it up in front of him. Illusions. On a knife? Alton asked. Orvius nodded again. There are 2 types of illusions. Optical, manipulation of the eye of a particular individual so only they see the change, Alton defined. Physical, manipulation of an object so everyone that views is misled. Perform both. Alton considered a number of his favorite illusions, but couldn't figure out how to use any of them on a knife. He needed to come up with something fresh, and decided to start with a physical illusion. He focused on the knife and the air around it, how it caught and reflected the light, and before long, Orvius was holding a stainless steel mirror. The handle, with its decorative floral design, had stayed more or less the same, but the blade had been stretched like dough into a flat metal oval. The little teeth of the blade were still visible on one side, and the center of the oval was reflective, like mirrored glass. Daniels walked around to Orvius's side of the island to get a better look at the mirror. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for my second trick. Alton focused on Daniel's eyes and how they brought in the dim illumination from the pot lights beneath the cabinets. He anticipated his view of the mirror from behind Orvius's shoulder and made his eye see something that wasn't there. Orpheus saw his own reflection, while Daniel saw his ex-wife standing right behind him, arms crossed, waiting in the doorway of the kitchen, just as Alton had seen her that one time she'd barged in looking for a watch she accused Daniels of selling. Panic-stricken, Daniels spun towards the doorway behind him. Finding it empty, he turned back to scowl at Alton. "You little," Daniels growled. "Very good, Alton," Orpheus said, putting down the utensil, which had returned to a simple silver blade. "You don't even know what he did," Daniels objected. "He fooled you." Daniels shut up. Orpheus laced his fingers together and laid his hands on the counter before him. "Summoning." Daniels opened his mouth in surprise, but was just as speechless as Alton. "You do know what summoning is, do you not?" Orpheus asked, still sitting patiently. Alton nodded. "The conjuring of demons from their realm to ours." "I don't want anyone summoning demons in this kitchen," Daniels said. Alton wasn't too thrilled about summoning demons either. "I've read about it and know how to do it, like, theoretically, but never actually summoned anything." "That's fine," Orpheus said. "Your theoretical understanding will do, for now." "So, is that all?" Alton asked, hoping he could now get a few hours of sleep before morning. "I believe so," Orpheus said. As he stood, his elbow knocked his mug of tea, spilling it across the counter. Alton hopped off his stool. "I'll get napkins." He turned and opened the cupboard, searching for the napkins that were hidden behind two interlocking elephant salt and pepper shakers. Alton paused in his search for a moment, mentally cursing himself. "This is probably a test. I should have used a reversal or evaporation spell." But Daniels was constantly going on about magical reliance and rebuking him for using it when he didn't need to. He thought it would just seem sloppy if he did it now, so he grabbed a fistful of napkins and turned back to the island. He barely saw it, slicing through the air, before the knife was inches away from his chest. It paused just in front of him, tip first, perfectly aimed to plunge into his heart, before it ricocheted away, hitting the lip of the counter, and then clattering across the tiles. Alton stared after it, shocked. Orpheus took a newsboy hat from his jacket pocket and calmly placed it on his head before nodding towards the counter, turning the tea to droplets, which quickly dispersed into the air. Daniels was staring wide-eyed at Orpheus. The knife had never touched Alton, but he wasn't entirely confident his lungs hadn't decided to give up breathing anyway. "Do you always keep that defense spell around you?" Orpheus asked. Alton felt air return to his body, his chest heaving with the release of the sudden indrawn breath he'd been too afraid to let go. "Yes." "Impressive. It must be exhausting. Spells and enchantments are one thing, but a constant shield," Orpheus said. "But it's unpredictable. You don't want dangerous spells bouncing off like that knife did. You should keep it closer to you. Tuck it around your skin." So it had been another test, unlike anything Alton had expected, and he had passed? "Does this mean you'll teach me?" Alton asked. "Our plane leaves in 2 hours. Go pack your things." Alton wasn't entirely comfortable with the fact that his new tutor had tried to kill him, but one look at Daniel's unhappy face had him up the stairs and throwing his things into a suitcase.
Let me help you tell your story the way you want it told. If you're in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, thriller, historical, or young adult, I have services that can definitely help you. I can produce, narrate, and master said audiobook so it's ready for Amazon and any other software you need. For more information, see my website at jpantelleresco.wordpress.com/audiobook-services. You worked hard to create that story, and I'll work just as hard to make sure it's told in the right way. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Mckayla and her narrator for doing a wonderful job. Am I still open to do narration for people? Yes, absolutely. I'm definitely hoping you guys are enjoying my take on Alice in Wonderland. I've had a lot of fun putting it together, and I hope you guys have a lot of fun listening to it. That all said, the show's the next step makes the most sense. Like I said earlier, sometimes your niche is right under your nose. I'm interviewing people, and that's what I do. And I got some great ones coming. A couple things to note: I'm doing Crip Week tomorrow night, 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You're gonna also see part one of my two-part conversation with Mckayla Eaton up and running because Michael and I had a humdinger of a conversation. This is my last two-parter, which kind of makes me kind of really happy and sad at the same time. Um, like I said, the show isn't really ending; it's evolving. But as the show is presently constructed, there's only 6 more episodes after this one. And I'm really debating what to do with 450, if I do as a thank you episode or if I do some more Alice, because I'm not entirely sure which is the right course. But don't worry, I will talk about the new format in a week, next week's episodes there. Yeah, if you guys want to support what's coming, I have a Patreon page, patreon.com/justjoshingpodcasts. You want to donate $1 here and there, that'd be great. That'd be a great way to do it. Like I said, I already got my first 8 guests lined up. And that's basically 2 weeks. That's right. I'm doing more episodes, but yeah. Like I said, I'm really excited for what's coming, and as you can tell, I have a lot I'm still holding back on. But for now, thank you for listening to this episode. Josh, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so any number of different ways. Subscribe to the podcast. I'm on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, Deezer, Audible. You name it, I'm there. Click the subscribe button, leave a review, let people know what's out there. More episodes are coming. They're going to be coming a little bit more rapid fire next couple days, so to get caught up as I am coming to the end of the wire here. Let me know if you want me to do something special for 450. My books, Alice Zero and The Cloud Diver, are available now on Amazon.com. They both have some nice reviews there if you want. Don't take my word for it that they rock. Cloud Diver is illustrated by Lance Bond. Alice Zero is illustrated by Mackenzie Carr. Definitely take a look at those. My Twitter and Instagram is jpenteloresco. My Facebook page is Josh Penteloresco Author Podcaster. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. I have a webpage, jpenteloresco.wordpress.com. I got a newsletter. I got merchandise. All those links are in the description below. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Joshua Penteloresco. That's where a lot of the action is going to be going forward. That would be greatly appreciated. Stay inspired, guys. Keep doing your thing, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Josh.